Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar with us today, Crisis Within a Crisis, Managing Multiple Events in the Age of COVID. Today we have presenting for you Prashant Jarisi of Everbridge, Matt Hinton and Lou Adesso from Control Risks. I wanted to let you know that we will do a 15-minute Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please use the chat box to ask any questions. We're more than happy to answer them for you. If we can't get to your question, we'll email you the answer. So right now I'd like to introduce Prashant. He will start taking you through the beginning of our presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Matt, Lou, thank you very much for joining me for this very important session. Happy to take a little bit of time and walk through how we view the world, how we're trying to help over the last 2 months, as anybody would imagine. Both Control Risks and Everbridge have been working with hundreds of customers that are affected by not just the pandemic, but emerging conditions in and around the pandemic, which haven't gone away in spite of our hopes, right? And so the idea is that when we start talking about leveraging any kind of a solution, I think the biggest mistake we could do, either as vendors, partners, individuals, or a society, is to start thinking of COVID-19 or the pandemic as a project for the summer. Let's do something now. Let's look at some, winding down of the spread, and suddenly it's back to normal. It's also dangerous for all of us to think of this as a product. Let's download an app. Let's do a wristband. Let's have a wearable. Let's do Bluetooth. And so it's pretty dangerous to start looking at the conditions that persist in the world today, either through the lens of a project or a product. I believe that COVID is not going to go away. As citizens, as employees, as corporations, customers, vendors, I think until we as a society, until we have confidence in the vaccine, its efficacy, and we also hope that there are no newer strains of the same virus, this will become our way of life. And so when we start thinking of this becoming the new way of life and a normal, I think we need to start thinking about something bigger than a simple project or a simple product or a piece of technology that can, be useful in this situation. That's the first aspect that I wanted to make sure we all shared from a macro situation perspective. And the other thing is, one size doesn't fit all, especially when we start interacting with each other, especially when things will come back to being normal. It won't be the same for every country, every city, every county, every state. The point is that no matter which way we look at it, even if we make the mistake of looking at this as a project, even if we make the mistake of looking at this as a product, one size is not going to fit all, right? We, as Everbridge, are based in Massachusetts. Just to let you know, if you go to Boston, the city, the rules of engagement on what people need to do in restaurants, in parks, as they walk their dogs along the Charles River is subtly different than the rest of the state. And so, taking into account the current situation and the fact that critical events in the world are not going to go away, on May 16th, massive cyclone hit the eastern seaboard of India. Right, just 2 weeks ago, big wildfire in north of Tucson, Arizona. Right, stabbing 2 weeks ago in England, as you heard. So we have to start looking at the current situation as an operational framework. This is how the world is going to be. And if this is how the world is going to be, what do we need to do as individuals, as a family, as a community, as a society, and then eventually leading to as a corporation, as a vendor, as a consulting partner, right? As a practitioner of risk frameworks that we put in place, we need to become very cognizant that unless we can define this in the context of an operational framework, which will be in place for years to come, we will not be able to successfully manage. And the reality is, all of us, everybody on this phone was blindsided by this pandemic. I don't think any of us realize the extent, the spread, and the impact it has had on our lives personally and professionally. And so, keeping that in context, I do want to talk about a few things that it's not about COVID. The the two examples or three examples that I gave as it pertains to the other events that are going out. Let's go and figure this out. 2 weeks ago, the governor of Massachusetts implored every citizen that participated in the protest to make sure that they go and get themselves tested. Why? Why was that done? That was done because 80% of the people were wearing masks. 20% of the population showed up not wearing any masks. Very dangerous situation. So we need to look at this operational framework not just as something that we need to do from the perspective of return to work, contact tracing application. We again need to look at it as if this is going to be our life moving forward. Having said that, let's figure out what is it that is challenging, right? Why is this so hard, right? Why can't we just pick a product and talk about it? It's because the amount and the level of noise that comes into the system, right? Information coming from a governor, information coming from CDC, information coming from the police network, then a weather event where the TV channel will give you certain news. A few groups of people will gather and start talking about this in social media. So the issue is the amount of stimuli that is coming in. It's becoming extremely hard to curate data to say, what am I really doing? Is my branch office really affected? Right? Are my employees in danger? What is called a safe corridor? Right? Is the commute clean today? What's happening out in and around my buildings? And that therefore takes us to the context of the noise that's coming in. Curating data is great, but your ability to say, hey, this is what it means from the perspective of impact. This is what it means in terms of risk. So assessing both the impact and the risk is very, very important. And that becomes very hard when you have thousands of sources of data coming into the system. And then the simple thing is, what do we really do about it? Do we actually have a standard operating procedure like I just discussed here? We all got blindsided. None of us had a standard operating procedure for a pandemic. But now that we know, what can we do, right? And eventually, we have to get into what a term that I will use later in our discussion, anti-fragility, right? If we do not have a way to learn from what we are doing today, how we got blindsided in the past, it's pretty easy to say, but it becomes very hard if the postmortem, the blameless root cause analysis, or any of these concepts has to happen manually. How can the system, the framework that we're going to discuss today, right, easily uncover the risks that exist in the system, potentially forewarn us about the risks that are coming through the system as you curate the data and get that stimuli, and make sure that we can put certain pieces in place to make sure that we respond exactly. And whether it is cybersecurity, whether it is pandemic, whether it's response to a severe alert, wildfire, hurricanes, we always talk in our industry about the concept of a dwell time. If you let that critical event dwell longer, risk is higher, the impact is more severe. So the faster we can detect, the faster we can respond, the faster we can act, and the faster we can learn to make sure our tomorrow is better than today, we can make sure that we have a better tomorrow than it is. And so given that, what it really means is a simple 4-step process. We will take these 4 steps and talk about in the context of the integrated risk framework that Matt and Lou will refer to. But the idea is we need to make sure that we are pretty accurate in making an assessment of not only the noise that is coming to the system, curate it to make sure we get the right signal, and also understand its impact on the assets, the people, the routes that we really care about. Then figure out what it means to making sure that we can locate the right teams that can help, or something as simple as our obligation to communicate to stakeholders and employees to protect them. And then we need to make sure that people can come together to act meaningfully. And this becomes really challenging in these days. In the olden days, we could say, all right, all hands on deck, let's all get into room number 3. We're not going to leave this room until we solve the problem. Guess what's happened now? We can't do that anymore. So when we talk about acting, we need to start thinking about meaningfully collaborating as well. So where do we integrate those technologies and those pieces in our operational framework that not only are we making sure that we communicate better, not only with our customers, our employees, our stakeholders, executives, but we also make sure we understand where people are, especially when they're remote, so that they can effectively bring forward the resolution process, but also ensure collaboration. And then the nature of the incident will change, right? A ticket usually gets opened as Sev 3, you do a bit of a triage and you realize, oh my God, this is bigger than a bread box. And so the whole concept here is to say, how do we put a framework in place to communicate better, right? To collaborate better, and then as the nature of the crisis changes, how do we make sure that we can actually have a business process orchestration that will lend itself seamlessly to the changing conditions? And we'll cover some of those concepts. And eventually, can the system gather analytics all the way? Something happened 10 times, 6 times you did well, 4 times you didn't do that well. What is the difference between those 6 events where you handled well and the 4 that you didn't? So real, well-informed analytics to make sure that in a cyclical fashion, your next assessment is better, your next way to communicate to stakeholders is better, and your next act is better than before. So given that framework, I do want to hand over the floor to Lou and Matt, discuss some of the common challenges that they are seeing, we are seeing, and all of us are seeing as we talk to folks like you.
Thanks, Prashant. For everyone on the call, I'm Lou Adesso. I'm Director of Control Risk's Critical Event Management Practice. And yeah, I really appreciate that overview of where we are now, kind of looking forward into this new reality, something we need to consciously structure for if we're going to get back into anything resembling kind of a stable stance. Even before considering multiple crises, COVID on its own had strained our supply chains, our critical vendors, and our budgets. We saw it in our personal lives with cell phone outages, with longer delivery times, with familiar businesses closing down. As planning and response professionals, we really need to challenge our assumptions about what response resources are going to be available when we need them and how effective they're going to be. We all know that feeling of missing a step, of something that you absolutely knew in your bones was going to be there and then suddenly discovering that it's not. To make sure we keep our footing, we need to consider how the world has changed, how supply shortages and overloaded transport companies could hamper your ability to ship critical items to areas in the path of a hurricane. We need to think about how, instead of just looking at the risk your corporate network was facing, sensitive work is now being transmitted via dozens or hundreds of different types of home modems and routers. Fulfilling your duty of care towards employees after natural disasters is complicated by the fact that now everyone's working from their homes instead of a single location. And because of the economic uncertainty we're all facing, many companies are restricting hiring. Simply expanding those prevention and response teams to deal with these challenges is just not an option for many of us. While a few organizations could honestly say they were prepared for all of the little surprises the last 2 years have given us, some were able to blunt the impact of those surprises. And we've seen a lot of success from organizations that have made use of a few relatively simple strategies. The first is risk monitoring. Having good intelligence sources and an honest understanding of your risk profile can keep you informed of what's on the horizon. And we need to think beyond just reactive incident monitoring. You really need to know what trends are developing, what's happening to your peers, what pots are getting ready to boil. Once you have that intelligence, you need to prepare efficient briefings to make sure your leaders know what could be coming. Again, kind of on that proactive stance, with that information, you can develop and regularly update scenarios for your key risks. What would a second wave of COVID infections mean? How could the outcome of an upcoming election impact your operations? You have to think about the spectrum of possibilities and the spectrum of response options. We're not saying that you need to write a novel for each one, but spending a bit of time just thinking through what your priorities and your available resources would be in different situations is going to pay huge dividends if anything even remotely similar occurs. And that's because what we saw is that organizations that had actionable and adaptable plans found themselves at a distinct advantage. They didn't need to invent the wheel, just sort of MacGyver up some snow chains. Even the most robust pandemic plan didn't cover anything like what we're going through right now, but many did provide guidance for managing infected employees and social distancing and scaling back travel, facility closure, many of the issues that organizations had to spend valuable energy struggling with when this pandemic first started hitting. And of course, technology can be a great help for all of these areas. And I think, Prashant, you have a couple slides talking about that.
Correct. Let's get into that right now. So let's start discussing about this whole concept of strained resources. I mean, before we can figure out, we did say, let's do a correct assessment, like Lou was covering, risk monitoring, right? Before we actually get to the concept of figuring out who can help, how they can help, do you have a global view of ensuring that you can actually see multiple dimensions of data, multiple sources of data, and the impact of all of that with respect to the assets, the people, and everything else that you're trying to protect? And so knowing the scenario from a risk monitoring perspective is the first step, right? If you're well informed, then you will put the right resource and the right plan in place. So obviously you're looking at the screenshot of an Everbridge product. This is how it actually works. This is from the product directly. In this specific case, you're seeing only COVID-related data, but understand that we have worked to ensure that we bring 22,000 different sources of data. Our risk intelligence monitoring service, which is part of our product offering, has 50 analysts. They work round the clock. We are proficient in 16 different languages. So when we say we curate data, when we say we separate signal from noise, this is the kind of meaningful information that we'll bring, right? What happens when a person has to commute from the home office to a building, but there is a protest on the way which is being planned? So a combination of factors will make sure that you understand the scenario within which you're operating, and then we can start putting together a meaningful plan in place. And that's what Lou was talking about. What is a lightweight framework that you put in place, and you call it a standard operating procedure, right? And then we'll say, all right, as time goes by and as we learn, as analytics come forth, we're going to fine tune the plan to make sure that it suits our needs better and makes our tomorrow even better than where it is today. If you look at what you're seeing here, London returned to work safely as an example, staying with the topic of return to work, you can see they look exactly identical. They all say prepare workplace for employee return, right? They all say do initial employee status check. The nuances are everything that you're seeing on the right, right? So this capability that's available on our platform jointly from both of us, you can see the nuances here. That same operating procedure that you have put in place on preparing workplace for employee return is now following a guideline from that local, regional, or country level guidance that has been provided. So you can see that while everybody has to prepare a workplace for return, it's very different. In certain countries, when you do an employee status check, you can ask invasive questions because you perhaps are allowed to. Certain countries, you cannot ask invasive questions. So can you define an operational framework that doesn't have to be customized to the nth degree, but at the same time respects and allows for the flexibility? So if you can put a lightweight umbrella process on top that can become your guide and a framework that you can operate, then you can start breaking this problem down. But you do need to make sure that whatever lightweight process you put in place has to be digitized, right? We did talk about strained resources. The more work you put this manually on a small group of people, the worse it gets. Two, it has to allow for flexibility that we will discuss today. Given that framework, let's go and talk about, if you don't have a simple operating procedure, if you don't even understand what landscape you're looking at, what kind of a burnout process that leads where we are today. So, Matt, if you want to take this away.
Great, thanks, Prashant. And just for those of you on the phone, so you know my voice, I am Matt Hint. I'm a partner at Control Risks and lead our crisis and resilience consulting business. Burnout is one of the most common challenges our clients have dealt with during crisis, during the COVID crisis, I should say. And there's probably a lot of people nodding their head right now on the webinar. And why is that? It's because for many organizations, a small group of individuals have been responsible for managing the COVID response since the beginning, and responsibility was never really delegated or operationalized into the business. And there's no doubt that this challenge will only grow as new crises emerge at the same time organizations are still struggling with COVID. And what we know about burnout is that it's further complicated by a few factors, right? So number one, fear. We've heard time and time again during the crisis that employees are scared to raise their hands and indicate that they're struggling due to a fear of being perceived as weak or not willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the company. In some cases, job security factors in as well. And needless to say, this could be further exacerbated with a second crisis. Personal strain. Unlike many crises that we face, this one has had a particular impact on the home front. And people are stressed and strained for a variety of reasons. Difficult work from home arrangements, spouses, children, and parents dealing with COVID, or even worse, dying from it. And this contributes to employee burnout, reduces employees' capacity to respond to one crisis, let alone two. For many companies who did not have pandemic crisis management, business continuity capabilities in place, these teams were formed to address the crisis, but they did so in an ad hoc manner. And in other words, crisis management team members were immediately on their back foot, managing the response as they go, and created massive inefficiencies that resulted in longer hours and increased stress from managing through that incident. And finally, around abrupt handover, for many of those same companies, that lack of formalized response program meant there were no formalized backups. And without backups, as burnout reared its ugly head, handovers have not gone over well. And employees who were put into that situation were forced to play catch up, again creating inefficiencies and long hours, on top of already long days and fulfillment of not only new crisis response duties, but their regular quote unquote day job duties as well. Now, the good news is that we have seen organizations successfully address burnout and these complications in several different ways. And the first is through use of alternates and using them strategically throughout the entire COVID response. Companies that have done this well have had alternate shadowing crisis management team meetings so that they were up to speed at a moment's notice. And the beauty of that is when, not if, a second or third crisis occurs, the crisis management team has incredible bench depth to flex alternates into either the COVID response or in some cases, the response to the new crisis. And quite frankly, could be spread across both of them. Their interconnectivity works to their advantage and helps provide a more seamless transition should alternates need to be more involved. In addition to shadowing, ensuring alternates are trained and engaged in crisis exercising helps tremendously. By understanding their roles and responsibilities, any sort of onboarding is really minimized and efficiencies are maximized. In addition to alternates, another successful method we've seen deployed is the use of split teams when multiple crises occur. So rather than having one team managing two crises and really adding fuel to the quote unquote burnout fire, you're splitting your crisis management team into two teams, one for each crisis, allowing the company to focus on both of them, but splitting it and not having it just be one group of people. And that may or may not include bringing those alternates in that we talked about. Now, this is only really possible with proper information management and sharing of key updates across teams, especially if crises are related and or merging, which is something we'll talk about later in the webinar. It's also helpful to delegate responsibilities related to the response into the organization and reduce some of that operational burden on the crisis management team to allow them to focus on more of the strategic elements to the response. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, before I hand it back over to Prashant, is it's important to set an example. Employees cannot get over their fear of speaking up or successfully managing the strains of home and work while managing multiple crises without knowing their companies behind them and the challenges they're facing. And there are several ways organizations are doing this, and these are just two examples that we'll highlight here. One is creating policies focused on reducing these issues and providing employees with both assurance that speaking up is encouraged, but also resources to help them manage the stresses at hand. The most common of these policies tends to focus on things like extended leave and the like, but it also includes setting up escalation paths for employees to raise concerns in the first place. And finally, tone at the top is one of those kind of consulting phrases that is often thrown around a lot, but it's actually quite important that leaders set an example for their employees and demonstrate their commitment to ensuring burning out doesn't occur. And we've seen this occur in a variety of ways, but sometimes it's as simple as having leaders communicate the importance of getting away from everything and truly unwinding, and then seeing them take vacation and live that experience themselves. That may sound a bit silly, but I can tell you it goes a long way. Prashant, back to you.
Excellent, excellent. So let's actually go look at the hows of it, right? We've talked the theory of the case. I think we all understand. We understand the concept of an operational framework, and then a combination of people, process, and product. There are three things, right? It starts with the people, like Matt said. It starts from the top. The tone has to be set. Whether it is your desire to have automation in place, whether it is your desire to make sure that you do better than you are doing today, or your desire to make sure that you care about the employees, whether it is because there's a legal or ethical obligation. So let's go ahead and actually see how to make this. So obviously we want to launch the right plan, whether it is, so how do you immediately determine whether you need the primary team? If the primary team is already taken up, how do you make sure you can reach out to the secondary team? If you reach out to the secondary team, you might have requirements to say, for me to successfully execute, I need at least one person from each department to show up. I'll take two examples here. Let's say that for a particular branch office to be ready, you need at least one person from facilities, one person from IT, one person from HR, right, to come together to say, hey, three of us get together and make sure the facility is ready for done. Each of them having a different obligation. When it comes to an IT issue, let's think of it, it's probably even simpler. When your web performance is slow, maybe there is a quorum that says, oh, web performance is slow, make sure that at least one person from the network, one person from the database, one person from the application side shows up before we can say we have a team that can meaningfully affect the resolution to the critical event. That should become seamless, right? If the primary person on shift is busy, you should be able to seamlessly go to somebody who's secondary in the shift, like the concept of not just split teams, but within split teams, figuring out how do we launch the correct response plan and reach out to the right people. And then what are the obligations? Quite typically, it's very fashionable to create tiger teams, cross-functional groups, we leverage different words, but essentially we'd say next time this happens, here are the 10 people who sign up. But at every single point of time during a crisis, we need to make sure that every individual knows exactly what needs to get done to meaningfully affect the response process, right? And at the same time, you don't want to be spending a lot of time in overhead. What do I mean? If you have to stop managing the crisis just to write an email and informing your manager what you're doing, and the manager has to take notes across his people, create another note, and send it to the VP, that's where we're wasting time. So how do we make sure that not only the responders know exactly what you have to do, but as they are carrying out their tasks meaningfully, stakeholders, customers, executives are getting meaningful information in an automated fashion so that everybody's energy is focused on making sure that you're actually working on the issue to resolve it. And then, look, the nature of critical events always change. No matter how good of a plan it is, like Matt and Lou were talking about, things will change. There is a framework that you have put in place, but you have to make sure that as things change, people should know where to go for information, right? What are the task lists that have been put in place? Here's a simple example of employee evacuation notification. Great to be able to send them a notification to say, all right, we're experiencing certain situation, evacuate. But do they know where to go, right? Is the information at their fingertips? Have they practiced this before? So concepts like those are critical in an operational framework because that is what will lead to effective communication. And then, like we talked about, you need to know what's happening. Here's a classic example and a lead into a topic that we're going to discuss about while we are focused heavily on the pandemic and return to work in COVID-19, unfortunately, natural disasters are not waiting for us, right? So, do you have a global view, single pane of glass, a dashboard where executives, responders, individuals, people who care about and want to subscribe to alerts can go? And it's very, very important to make sure that we, as part of the framework, implement certain pieces of the solution that can give you that visibility, right? And each group will have their own perspective of how they look at the crisis, and each group will have its own task list that they need to carry out. And so learning from those activities that are currently in progress to understand what's the trend over the same incidents that have happened in the past, know how you are currently performing and how you had performed in the past will be a great source of information to make sure that we can improve our response to a similar crisis or a pattern of crisis in future. So dashboards, analytics, trending chart, performance of groups, individuals, right? Executions of tasks, your adherence to SLOs, SLAs becomes extremely critical in this situation. And all this needs to happen naturally. All this needs to happen in a fashion where it does not create a process overhead of checklists and checkpoints that you're stopping to focus on paper process rather than responding to the crisis itself. So here are some examples that you folks are seeing on how the system captures all these pieces of information that you can make meaningful in your days to come. But as I said, this was a lead-in, the example of an earthquake or an alternate critical event. With that, I want to hand it back to Lou and Matt to say, well, the wildfire didn't stop in Arizona. Hurricanes are still forming, right? And a cyclone did hit the eastern seaboard of India. So Matt, Lou, what's your perspective on multiple crises that face us?
Yeah, great, Prashant. And it's a great question and definitely an interesting topic, right? When crises merge. Throughout the webinar, we've been talking about the challenges of managing two crises at once. And it may be the case that two crises have absolutely nothing to do with each other, but there's also a good chance that they do, further complicating the equation when we talk about managing multiple crises at once. And so what do I mean by this? So one example comes in the form of insider risk. COVID requires a significant amount of attention from leaders in the organization, often resulting in them being distracted from many of the day-to-day controls they once oversaw. This is only further complicated by the fact that many organizations have started reoccupying offices and entering this new hybrid work environment where a base of employees remains in the work from home environment, and a base of employees are now returning to offices, warehouses, factories, stores, restaurants. And as a result, management could be even more distracted, dealing with not only the new hybrid approach, but the changes in the risk profile that come with it. And so that means times are right for something like insider risk to materialize, whether it be a fraud or a data breach. The reality is that the COVID crisis could be at least partially responsible for the second crisis. And now organizations find themselves having to deal with both crises at the same time, something they may not have experienced prior to COVID, and the changes that COVID brought to the organization. Lou, I know you had another example you wanted to highlight as well.
Yeah, so just speaking to the graph on the left, in a lot of organizations, these are things that would have been handled by very separate teams. Civil unrest by security, pandemic by HHS or HR, supply chain by logistics or operations. But in recent weeks, particularly, we've seen how these three can interact and converge. You can have a surge in civil unrest leading to a spike in COVID cases a week or two down the line, which might lead to localities reinstituting lockdown procedures and closing down non-essential businesses. Everything can really affect everything else in a way that's been quite unusual in the past. And you really need good communication between the teams and a centralized team setting your priorities to avoid being caught off guard. Each of these can kind of tip you off that something else is on the horizon.
Great, thanks, Lou. The real question then becomes, so what can you do about this, right? And the fact that you may be managing multiple interconnected crises. And first things first, you need to ensure your governance is in place. There must be proper oversight over both crises, including senior leadership insight into how each of these crises impact each other in order for this to work. That must include clear rules and responsibilities for all teams involved, including clear escalation and de-escalation paths, given the impact one crisis might have on the other. In addition, information management is absolutely key. It's my belief that traditional sit reps will no longer do when managing multiple interconnected crises. Rather, big picture updates that cross both crises and stress impact of the business are key. One way we're seeing companies manage this is by dedicating a liaison that sits in between the two crisis management teams with the sole responsibility of information sharing between the teams, highlighting key risks and issues, actions, responsibilities, and timelines. And finally, an interconnected mindset is incredibly important. You don't want to make a decision about one crisis without thinking through the implications and impacts that that decision would have on the other crisis. So as an example, right, in our insider risk example, you don't want to take an action that addresses a data breach, but at the same time shuts down work from home abilities. These crises need to be managed separately, but monitored and actioned as one, or else impacts can be further exacerbated and the company can find itself in quite a dangerous position. So Prashant, I'll hand back to you now.
Perfectly said, perfectly said. I mean, somebody had said before, I remember, that, there's always going to be pressure. We live in a tough world, but you don't have to be always stressed. And I think the difference between pressure and stress is how well prepared you are. So having this framework that we're discussing and making sure that we actually understand how it impacts us, and then leveraging technology to make sure that it helps us, not hinders us, would be very critical. And I think when we talk about merging crisis, we need to make sure, like I said, multiple things can happen. And like both Lou and Matt said, either they're being handled by completely separate teams, either they are completely asynchronous, unrelated events, or they have deep implications on one from the other. Right. So that give you a simple example. Like we talked about, a cyclone hitting eastern seaboard of India. They do leverage Everbridge platform. Now that state is under curfew, shelter in place. Well, when there is a cyclone, you have to evacuate people and put them in a safe place. There are not a lot of safe hotels, stadiums. So what happens when you're supposed to evacuate people in the face of a shelter-at-home order, right? So here are some examples of crises that overlap in such a fashion that they might create competing, results of response. So that's what we need to make sure is that when situations change, will the system allow the flexibility that we talked about, right? Maybe the one team is already tied up, right? And you have a good understanding, but you want to shift to an alternate team. The alternate team may not have the right skill set, but at least start helping. So can you ask and add tasks as you go along? And while these multiple crises are being handled, can you make sure you continue communicating effectively? Because now it's just not one thing. It's multiple things, multiple teams with tremendous amount of overlapping responsibility. And so that's the one aspect I did want to share with all of you. The other thing which I think we take very seriously here at Everbridge is what we call as the Everbridge network. I did start by saying the first thing we all need to have is information. If we have the right information, if it's curated the correct way, we can make intelligent decisions. We can do informed actions. And the Everbridge network is where we bring that value to our customers. As you folks know, whether it is state and local governments, higher education, airports, corporations, financial institutions, all these folks leverage the Everbridge platform. I gave you the example of the cyclone hitting India. The entire state receives notification based on Everbridge network. So when we say we can bring data from John Hopkins, CDC, supply chain disruptions, weather, protests, police networks, social media, right? We bring the power of analytics to your doorstep. We can actually triangulate information coming from multiple sources, separate out signal from noise to make sure that we actually help you laser focused on the exact action that you're supposed to take as part of the Everbridge network. But given that, given the amount of analytics that are coming in, we also need to make sure that we are prepared well for tomorrow. This was all a discussion about an operational framework in action. That doesn't necessarily inform what you need to change and how your tomorrow can be better with the analytics that you've gathered. With that, Matt and Lou will hand this over to you.
Thanks. I would like to pause here for just a moment to appreciate this picture. This is my favorite picture in the whole presentation. I feel like this guy is all of us. He's built this boat out of duct tape and cardboard, and it is totally working. He is afloat. He is moving forward. It's only falling apart a little bit. But that is also the face of a man that knows if anything unexpected happens, he's going to have to learn how to swim real fast. Every organization we've worked with has had to do some degree of scrambling in the wake of COVID. Some things have worked and some haven't. Some departments and processes weren't quite as resilient as expected. Others were perhaps much more so. As an example, right before all this happened, we were wrapping up a business continuity engagement with one of our clients in the tech sector. As part of their recovery plans, nearly every team we spoke with late last year indicated that they needed to be in an office after a couple of days, even just a temporary space. They really needed physical collaboration or they couldn't do their jobs. 4 or 5 months into working from home, and all of those jobs are still getting done. They came up with new ways to collaborate and communicate, and they proved to be much more resilient than they thought they were. The challenge here is formalizing that process a little bit, making sure that all the work, all the scrambling and innovating that was done to get your organizations to where they are today is captured and refined and baked into your processes and teams. So the next time you're asked to do the impossible, you have a better blueprint for what works. We've been calling this process the in-flight review. It can be as comprehensive as you have the bandwidth for. When we conduct these on behalf of clients, we just start by having open and honest conversations with people who were involved in or relied on the response. What do you wish you knew 6 months ago? What strengths did you see in how you responded? Where do you think there's room for improvement? And everyone is busy, but in many cases, we found that these are questions that have been top of mind. People have been thinking about this for months. They're really happy to talk about it. They're curious about what their peers are doing and what their colleagues' experiences have been. And this is the kind of information that leadership is looking for as they try to plan for what's needed long term. Another critical part of change management is testing that change. Sure, update your plans, your teams, your governance structure, get some new tools, but then make sure they work for you, that it's a good cultural fit, that people understand what their roles and responsibilities are. And finally, none of this matters without accountability, and that doesn't mean taking people to task if you found room for improvement, but it does mean making sure that bad habits are being checked, that procedures are being followed, that individuals and teams know how they fit in the overall response framework. Prashant, I think you have a few slides on how we can leverage technology to help here.
Absolutely. So let's take an example of this. Part of our tabletop exercises could be, look, the primary staff is highly strained. This is an actual real example from a hospital system. Here's a tabletop exercise, right? You need backup staff, and you need backup staff for a certain period, and you need to carry out certain tasks that are necessary. You can see on the mobile app here, you're actually trying to build a volunteer team, right? And based on the volunteer team, you're going to put a new change in place to say, all right, here are the primary shifts, here are the secondary shifts, and here's a volunteer team that can carry out activities to help both the primary and the secondary team. So as part of the change management, you're seeing the hows of how we put together. You can go this by incident zones. All right, where we need help is in that area that we're seeing right there. Look at the flare-ups that are going on, right? Make sure that we do tabletop exercises by simulating certain incidents and alerts that are happening in the place, and then figure out whether, as part of the tabletop exercises, you were successfully able to execute, right? Or they're in progress, or you actually failed in the tabletop exercise to continuously monitor and fix the situation. But the idea is very simple. As part of this framework that Matt and Lou and I are discussing, can we go from response to learning, right? It starts with the basic detection. If you don't even have a single stimuli, we're not going to do anything. And once we have a stimuli, we need to have a way to respond to it. We can do it in an ad hoc fashion, we can do it in a manual fashion, or we could put a standard operating procedure right up front to make sure that we have a plan in place. Second is to make sure that that plan that we have put in place has resilience. And this is where we then move into the world of what I call anti-fragility, right? As things change, right? As we learn new things, as we see cracks in the system, or we see operational improvements that can be had, can we now take the same system, the framework that we have defined, go across people, process, and products to see how we can convert this into an opportunity for learning and adapting for a better tomorrow? So towards that end, as part of the framework, Matt, Lou, would you like to talk a little bit about that framework itself?
Yeah, absolutely, Prashant. Thank you. So when you think back to everything we've discussed so far on this webinar, and the fact that COVID is going to be with us in some capacity, likely for another 18 to 24 months, the question becomes, what do we need to do in order to manage the challenges and the complexities that come with that inevitable second or third or fourth crisis that we have to manage while still managing COVID? And I think our answer is really an evolved approach to crisis management and business continuity, and a framework heavily focused on operational resiliency, and one that includes a proactive triage group that leverages technology to convert actionable intelligence into decision support and monitorable tasks for scenario analysis response teams. Now, I recognize that's a mouthful, but it's actually quite straightforward and really built upon true crisis management and business continuity fundamentals, because this is absolutely not the time to move away from those. This is absolutely the time to try and enhance them to better prepare you as you move forward. So let's break this down. So people, right? We've talked about this a couple times on the webinar. People are absolutely critical to an effective crisis response and overall program. We believe it's critical that an organization creates a dedicated triage team focused on proactively monitoring the company's risk landscape and assessing the potential and real impact on the organization, and ultimately then determining when that risk needs to be escalated to the crisis management team for action. The triage team could come in many shapes and sizes depending on the size of the organization and how they manage risks. So for some companies, this might be their enterprise risk management group. For others, it may be some sort of cross-functional team that includes folks from security, compliance, supply chain. For others, it may simply be 1 to 2 individuals with dedicated responsibilities to monitor and proactively escalate risks of concern. Upon being raised to the crisis management team, they should do much of what they do right now. Formally assess the risk, determine key actions, assign those actions, provide strategic guidance as they're executed. And that team should be supported by operational or scenario-specific teams that should absolutely be in the weeds, acting as the arms and legs to the response to the by the organization. And the simplest example of this type of team is a hurricane response team, something we know a lot of companies, probably a lot of folks on the webinar here, are firing up at the moment, given the impending hurricane season here in the Americas. Information. All of these teams must leverage information in order to be effective. One of the most critical pieces to effective response during COVID has been companies using scenario analysis to help them think through best case, worst case, most likely scenarios, and creating proactive plans to address them before they occur. Simply put, these types of activities are not only best practice, but they should continue beyond COVID and focus on the larger set of risks that could materialize as crises in the organization. We get asked a lot, this was one black swan event, what about the others? Well, scenario analysis can play a very, very important role to answer that question and should be an absolute part of the framework that you build going forward. These scenarios should be enabled by intelligence and risk monitoring, both the daily block and tackle type analysis, but also more forward-looking strategic analysis and guidance on a global and local level, given how different the breakout is both globally and locally, that helps enable effective decision making. And this is where this triage group can play a really important role, because it should be them monitoring how these scenarios are playing out and proactively raising their hands when predefined conditions are met. This will allow organizations to potentially get ahead of an emerging crisis, even potentially avoid them, but at a minimum, reduce the impact of the crisis through fast and proactive behaviors. Similarly, the crisis management teams and supporting teams will need to leverage this information during the response as scenarios and analysis are updated throughout the process to aid in determining planning and actions. Lastly, for my part at least, is process. And when we talk about process, what we're really talking about here are the ways of working. And this includes ensuring governance reflects this new model and that teams have proper plans and tools and training to be effective. But it also means creating scenario-based plans based on the scenario analysis conducted during responses, because you need to be able to allocate limited resources and prioritize how the company responds to the crisis. And as an example, I saw this firsthand. Companies that engaged in scenario planning around the recent protests fared far better than those that didn't, all while still dealing with COVID. Those that were a step ahead of the protests and thought through the wide range of impacts it had not only on their business, but their employees and their families. And it's a powerful tool and one that is critical for managing multiple crises at once. Worth noting, these scenario-based plans are not to replace all hazards crisis management planning, but really to supplement and complement them by thinking through the unique aspects of a particular crisis while still preserving that flexibility and agility that comes with our all hazards-based approach. And in addition to scenario planning, as Lou already mentioned, a focus on continuous improvement is key. This is something we've preached for years, but COVID really has brought the importance of this to life. Organizations that have taken the time to reflect on their COVID response, both the good and the bad, have tended to be more thoughtful in their responses to other crises, but also in their business resumption activities as people move back into the office. So worth ending my piece here on saying, self-reflection isn't always easy, but it's absolutely crucial when it comes to this sort of framework. Lou, I'm just going to quickly hand over to you to wrap this up.
Yeah, the engine that's driving everything that Matt was just talking about has to be your technology. You really need both. It's going to be extremely challenging to work through all of the challenges that we're going to face without some kind of force multiplier in the background, helping you do more with the team that you have. You can use technology to distill down hundreds of intelligence sources into the events and developments that could impact your organization. Make sure that the right people have access to that intelligence, your scenario analyses, your plans. You can use it to gain passive visibility into how activated scenario teams are doing, which really cuts down on the number of status updated and check-in meetings that are eating up your calendar. You can dashboard that information out for the crisis management team and other executives, giving them the big picture view they need to set priorities and distribute resources. The right tools can help you conduct wellness checks on hundreds or thousands of people in minutes, gather your team virtually into a secure conference and communicate with your peers. And finally, as we've all learned over the last few months, you absolutely need to leverage technology to enable collaboration between remote teams and remote team members. Prashant, back over to you.
Excellent framework. I mean, the good news, folks, is everything that we discussed today is available at your fingertips. It's neither control risks or Everbridge woke up today and say, oh, there's a pandemic, let's create a product. This has been out there for a long time. But in very, very specific details, I do want to share that we jointly have offerings that are production grade, available, already in use by other customers. Like I talked about, your ability to curate data from 22,000 different sources, right? Not just related to COVID, but everything else that's happening in the world. And it would be in the context of your assets and the people that you're recovering. Standard operating procedures that you're seeing to make sure that you can recover operations, do bring back to work processes in place, make sure you can handle multiple crises, available to you today. All the screenshots that you saw in the slide deck today are from the actual product itself. Obviously, the most fashionable thing to talk about is contact tracing. Clearly, we've had elements of contact tracing for a long, long time. Safe corridors, GPS, SOS, our ability to figure out travel itineraries, our ability to integrate with badging systems, our ability to extract data from Wi-Fi routers that you connect to. All those are different elements of contact tracing that's available to you. And now the latest one is Bluetooth-based key exchange. So those concepts of contact tracing is also available. And then eventually we can get into pretty exotic use cases. I mean, if you want really to install thermal scanners where you want to make sure that an elevator door does not close if more than 2 people enter the elevator, well, we could do exotic cases like those as well. But keeping it very simple, like I said, we talk about the framework and then in a phased manner, making sure that you can automate it. And the fact of the matter, folks, when I talked about, this whole concept of Everbridge network, you can actually see how many customers we already have. Critical events like these and our role and our obligation to help our customers has been in place for decades now, right? And from the privacy perspective, security perspective, compliance perspective, and scalability perspective, we have been in the industry for a long, long time, making sure that we keep and continuously deliver value to our customers. And we'll bring the power of analytics of all this data, best practices across verticals, best practices across customers, right, to make sure that we can give you something out of the box that can be a self-starter or a jump-start kit. And finally, I just want to underscore the point that neither Control Risks or Everbridge came to life just because of the pandemic. This relationship or this webinar, activities like this, these have been in place for a long, long time, even before we had the pandemic. This is a framework which we believe in, even in the absence of a discussion like COVID, because like we talked about, people, process, products, information, operating procedures, these are the realities of our corporate life today. And we need to make sure we bring the best of both the worlds at your feet to make sure we can deliver the value. Lou, Matt, I'm really proud and happy to be partnering with you folks and deliver value to our customers. You've been working with us for a while now. Do you want to add a little more color on how you view the world?
Well, just to quickly close out, I really appreciate Everbridge for hosting Matt and I. This has been great and honestly interesting for me as well. We have at Control Risk decades of experience helping our clients with their readiness, response, and resiliency programs. And now with this partnership, we're all very excited to be able to deliver that expertise through Everbridge's market-leading technology, really providing turnkey solutions for all of you, so that when you're looking at this platform, when you're looking at all of the things that we were just talking about, you can leverage us to help you out so that you can get these programs off the ground faster. And again, just in conclusion, thanks a lot, Prashant. Thanks a lot, Everbridge, for hosting us here.
Thank you very much. You're welcome. So, Amy, at this point, I think, I don't know how much time we have left, but happy to take questions, or if you have run out of time, we can make sure we send email responses to every question we get asked.
Thanks, Prashant. Actually, we have about 15 minutes. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to add that in the chat box and we'll take 15 minutes and go ahead and answer those for you. I don't see any coming in now. I know one big question that we had all along is, are we going to be able to share the webinar? And the webinar is being recorded and I will share that out tomorrow. I don't see any questions coming in. If you have any questions, feel free. Oh, no, here comes a few. They're coming in now. The first question is, how easy is it to import existing BCM plans into Control Risks so customers are not starting from scratch?
For the combination, it'll be a combination of two. We have to figure out what format you folks are in. Clearly, the screenshots that you saw, they all have an API format and a structure to it. And so I think it'll be a simple exercise of making sure that we look. Now, if it's a Word document or a GRC policy document, remember that you can attach images, plans, Word documents, anything to the same digitized system that the screenshots that you saw. What do I mean? You just simply create a hook in our system, and when somebody is on their mobile app, iPad, desktop, and they want to know what the operating procedure is or a checklist is, right within their small scale or desktop device, they can actually see the checklist. So we can directly attach these documents and all. What I was also saying is that the digitized process itself comes with an API layer. So if you want to take the Word document and convert that individual checklist into a run list, which is completely digitized, that's possible as well. And by the way, you can add these tasks along the way. What does that really mean? You might start with a 3-hook or a 3-step process. Somewhere along the way, HR thinks that they need to go and add one more policy document that somebody needs to follow. On the fly, you can attach a task list, point to a GRC document, a business continuity document, a PDF file, an image, a screenshot. A lot of first responders do this. While there is a standard operating procedure, while the task list is going on, let's say that there is a road accident, the car is on fire, right? The responder can actually take a picture and add that picture to the running task list so that folks at the back office have the context of what that crisis really means. So as things change, we give you a seamless way to make sure that we can absorb all the plans that you have put in place right now without too much of heavy lifting.
That's great. Thank you. Our next question comes from Raphael Marson. What is the key learnings from this COVID-19 event for organizations? What should we start preparing for next?
So I will answer from a technology perspective, but as framework experts, Matt, Lou, I would love for you to chime in here. I mean, look, the lessons we've learned is I'll be very transparent here. We were blindsided. All of us had business continuity plans and all of us put these procedures in place, but none of us knew the extent and the impact of it, right? And so certain organizations that I'm aware of went into an extremely, pessimistic mode of operations, immediately shutting it down, draconian measures for as one customer spoke, and others were behaving quite optimistically. Others just left it to the choice of the employees. So the lessons we've learned is, unfortunately, people didn't have a plan. And that's the biggest lesson here, is that even if something brand new comes, did you have a framework to support surprises? And like Matt and Lou were talking at the initial stage of this webinar, the biggest learnings here is that the companies that put the framework in place were far less surprised than those that did not. Matt, Lou, any perspective from your side?
Yeah, it's Matt. I'll jump in with one thought and then maybe hand it over to Lou. I mean, one of the lessons we've been learning very recently is around really business resumption and those companies that really didn't think through it and how they were going to get back to the office and deal with this new hybrid environment. They've struggled pretty mightily, and recent rollbacks of government restrictions and what have you recently have further complicated that. So I think that piece around getting that resumption planning piece right is quite important. I'd say and that all fits into the framework that we've been talking about. I think even on a more tactical level where we're seeing a lot of complication is around, okay, we're going to bring people back. We're going to start operating in this new world under all of these new rules. Well, who's going to be the enforcer of that, right? Who's going to be the enforcer of all these new rules, and what's that going to look like, and how's that going to operate? That is something that companies have been struggling with a lot recently. So as you're looking forward and thinking about the new world and the new frameworks and plans and resumptions and all of that sort of thing, don't forget or don't lose sight of the idea of the enforcer, because it's quite important in all of this. Lou, anything else?
Yeah, I think just to build on that a little bit, for me, the key learnings are just that as busy and stressed as we all are now, we need to acknowledge that this is the new normal for a year or two. We need to build out that framework. We also need to acknowledge that we already have a lot of the pieces of that framework now. It's just a matter of kind of structuring around them, strengthening where we need to, and being very deliberate about how we think about that organization going forward. I think for a lot of the organizations that I work with, the two concepts that might be relatively new are just spinning up that triage group. So an operational group with a global view who can kind of handle that organization around the different activated scenario teams, taking in the intelligence analysis, looking at global risk, and then also the scenario analyses themselves, the idea of just kind of war gaming out, 15 minutes with your team, a couple of different options, what could happen if this goes this way.
Excellent.
Thank you. Our last question comes from Michael Prasad. Where did you come up with the term crisis event management?
I'm not, well, we call it critical event management, but it's equally applicable to the word crisis event management. I'm not sure who came up with it. Maybe our CTO came up with it. We truly believe that that's what we need to do. And the value proposition, at least I can tell you, was very simple. Bad things happen in the world, and we care about good things. When bad things happening in the world intersect with the good that we want to protect, we have a critical event. So the entire premise of critical event management was based on that simplicity. And we never gave it a thought whether that means an earthquake, a shooting, a pandemic, supply chain disruption, an insider risk, a breach on your firewall. It's simple. Bad things trying to impact the things we're trying to protect.
Thank you. That's all the questions we have. Thank you, Prashant, Matt, and Lou, and thank you to all of you who took the time out of your day to join us for this webinar. We'll send out a copy of the replay to all of you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, folks.